everybody. It is great to see you, great to be with you. My name is Scott. I want to wish you a happy Father's Day weekend if you're celebrating. I had a great classic kind of dad moment a couple weeks ago. So the kids just got out of school. It was a Saturday morning. They had these hopes of going, hey, week after week throughout this whole year, I've had to wake up early. I've had to go to school. Sometimes they want to be there, sometimes they don't. But finally, they're out of school. It's a Saturday morning. It's beautiful. So I get this great idea that because I'm literally the worst person in the world, is a great day for us to do like some yard work as a family. Like they should just go ahead and get up. It's a beautiful day for that. And so they're excited to do that, as you would imagine. So we're out there and we're doing it all. Going, hey, we got mulch. We're going to spread this mulch. And there's all sorts of spider webs out there. And everybody's excited for spiders. And so we're knocking down those webs. And we've had, so much rain over this year, so there's just weeds that need to be pulled. So we're having a great day. As I recall, like everybody's excited about it, and it's beautiful. And then as we're out there enjoying everything, I just notice it's kind of quiet. Like it's kind of quiet out there, a little too quiet. So I look around, and I just realize I'm out there completely alone. The kids are not there. But I'm a good dad, so I'm like, oh no, I hope they're all right. So I go inside just to check on them, and I'm going, okay, is everything all right? I find them both in their rooms, and I go, what happened? And they said, well, I had to go to the bathroom. And that was like 35 minutes ago. That was their way to get back into the house. And then from that point on, they stayed there. And so in that moment, we're talking about emotional health today. In that moment, the emotion that I was feeling was just this initial frustration, this disappointment in them, a sense of betrayal maybe, perhaps, I don't know. But then that emotion, it quickly morphed into something else, which was just this giant sense of pride. I'm like, that's a slick move. Props to my kids for doing that. But not only that, it was like, I used that move so much as a kid. And so I just realized I finally was able to pass something on to my kids. So I have to say real quick, just in case Dad, you end up watching, I'm sorry for the times when you needed help with yard work, but I had to go to the bathroom. And the other times where it was Christmas season and you want to put the lights up on the house, and I was happy to do that, but I had to go into the bathroom. Or even the times where you're going, hey, we got to clean up this bathroom, but I had to go to the bathroom and I couldn't do that either. Right? So again, excited to finally pass something along to my kids. Well, today we are continuing this series, Healthy and Whole, where we're basing this on this idea that what people see when they look at us is really just a small fraction of our whole selves. It's similar to an iceberg, and you get the image of this idea. People say, hey, with an iceberg, you really only see 10% that's above the surface, and then there's this 90% that's underneath the surface. So for us, the 90% that really shapes us are these different components of our lives that we're talking about. It's our physical, our mental, our emotional, and our spiritual health. And we've said that these are essentially the inner parts of us that form or inform what people see on the outside. And during this series, we've locked into this idea that what comes out of us, it expresses what's stored up in us. And when Jesus was actually asked a question of Jesus, what is the most important thing, most important command? What's the thing that I build my life around, that standard that should guide my life? He said, well, it is to love God and to love people with your entire selves, with your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength, with everything you got, and not to live segmented lives where you hold part of yourself back from that. And so in this series, we are looking at 4 different components of our lives, our physical, our mental, our emotional, and our spiritual health. 4 components that we've said, hey, these are so intertwined. They're interconnected, they're interrelated, and they all influence each other, and they're influenced by each other. And we're making it known that 1 week in a topic, it does not get us to the finish line in any of these areas. This is just the beginning of it, but it gets us walking in the right direction that we want to go down. And so each week as we go through it, we're seeking to give some really simple, realistic next steps that we can all take as we want to grow in these areas. And as I mentioned, this week, we're going to be looking at our emotional health. Well, in survey after survey, where parents are asked to share their greatest hopes for their kids, it's probably no surprise to you to hear that the most common response that is given is that parents, more than anything else, more than financial stability, more than career achievements, more than physical health, the one thing that parents want is the parents say, I just want my kids to be, and I was wondering if it was going to change to like TikTok celebrities, but it's still happy. I want my kids to be happy. That's the one thing that I want. And new studies are showing that when this translates into a type of parenting that's like obsessing over their kids' moods, or this momentary, like I want them just to be smiling all the time, or I want things to be easy for them, when that type of parenting is the norm, well, it actually backfires and it leads to more negative effects on kids. However, I know many parents. I know many of you who are parents, and you might say the same thing, and you might go, you know what, but that's not what I'm going for here. I don't think you're obsessed with making sure your kids have a smile on their face all the time or life's always easy. I think it actually points to a broader hope that we have, like a more encompassing definition of what happiness actually is. So I think parents, they want their kids to grow up with a lot of different things. They want their kids to grow up with a sense of contentment or satisfaction. Like I want them to be people who are filled with joy, or they have this peace. Parents want their kids to be well-adjusted and emotionally balanced and resilient and hopeful. Parents want their kids to become adults who are still okay when everything else around them is not okay. In other words, parents are saying, hey, you know what? No matter where my kids wind up and what they wind up doing and who they wind up with, I want them to be all of these things first, and then we'll go from there. And that's not asking too much, right? Like, that's just a simple thing. I want them to be happy. And you know why I think that people want that for their loved ones? It's because when it comes to these things, we go, you know what? These are the types of things that we want for ourselves. And yet you know the reality that as a society, fewer and fewer people are actually experiencing those things, feeling that way. Instead, there's alarming rise of different responses, of different feelings, greater and higher levels of fear or dread or anger or anxiety or discontentment with life or depression and resentment. And so if we said, hey, you know what, there's like this dartboard, and those things that we mentioned of what really means to be happy, if those things are the bullseye, the question becomes, well, how do we land there? How do we get those things? Well, I think that to begin, it would actually be helpful to define what we're talking about. So psychologists define emotional health as a combination of the way you feel about yourself, the quality of your relationships, your ability to manage your emotions, and your capacity to deal with difficulty. And so people who are emotionally healthy, well, they have a sense of contentment. They have peace. They have a zest for life. They're the type of people who are actually able to laugh and to have fun with those around them. They're marked by this ability to rebound from adversity quickly and to deal with stress in healthy ways. And yet, on the contrary, when we aren't emotionally healthy, our whole body suffers as a result, because as we've talked about, all of these components are so interconnected. And so the negative thoughts and the feelings we experience, well, they can create chemical reactions in our own physiology. They can lead to things like weakened immunity or chest pains or shortness of breath or fatigue, back pain, high blood pressure, digestion issues, and so much more. Like, these things are not new news to you. Poor emotional health, it can completely derail like our wellness in every area of life. And so as we talk about that, we go, okay, that's something that sounds important, so no wonder we want that. And how do we get there? And I want to make a suggestion, and honestly, as I say this, I imagine there are going to be people who go, you know what, I don't like the way that sounds. But I want to suggest that in order for us to feel happy, in order for us to truly feel happy, not simply like a momentary mood, but to have joy and contentment, to be emotionally whole and healthy people, I think in order for us to feel happy, we must do what makes us happy. But that may not end up being exactly what you'd expect. So in order to get us there, we're going to take a look at a very powerful passage from a letter that's known as Colossians. And this letter was written by a man named Paul, the Apostle Paul. And he was one of the most influential followers of Jesus to have ever lived. And he lived during the first century. And he wrote this letter to the church in Colossae. It's a city in Asia Minor. And Paul actually hadn't met the people who were part of this church, but he was companions with Epaphras, the person who actually founded the church. And so it's while Paul is in prison in Rome that Epaphras visits him and gives him a bit of an update on how things are going with the church community in Colossae. And he's saying, hey, here's what's going well, and here's what's not. Here's where they're struggling with. And specifically for them, they're facing a lot of cultural pressure to kind of blend in or turn away rather than fully following the way of Jesus. So as Paul writes, he encourages them and he gives them this big picture idea that it's just as Jesus, Jesus died and he rose to new life, that we as his followers, we are to live new lives as new creations. And there's no part of these new lives that are to remain untouched or unchanged by the love and the leadership of Jesus. Paul wants them to know that following Jesus, it totally changes who we are, it transforms how we are, and it extends to everywhere we are. And so as chapter 3 begins, he dives right into this big idea. Colossians 3, verse 1, he says, since you have been raised to new life with Christ, set your sights on the realities of heaven. He's saying, since everything has changed, live right now as the new creations that you are. Let it impact every part of you. And as he continues, he illustrates what that might look like. We go to verse 5. He says, so put to death the sinful earthly things that are lurking within you. Have nothing to do with sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires. Don't be greedy, for a greedy person is an idolater, worshiping the things of this world. He's saying, okay, there's a way that you were. There's a way that you were, and you probably wanted to be happy, so you lived this way. But these things end up defining your behavior, and they have this unhealthy grasp on you, where life ends up being all about me. It's what I want. It's me doing what I want with whom I want, whenever I want. But he says, that's not the life that God had for you. And so in verse 7, he says, you used to do these things when your life was still part of this world. Like, that's who you used to be. And when your life is focused on self and not following Jesus, a life like that makes a lot of sense. But that's not you, so it's time to live like the new you. So verse 8, he says, now is the time to get rid of. Now is the time. I love that. He doesn't say like, hey, eventually, or in the future, or when you're forced to, or when you get to a point where you realize like everything has fallen apart, then that'll be the time. But he says now. Now is the time to get rid of, like to drop, to discard, to remove these things that are stunting your growth, hurting your relationships, not reflective of the way of Jesus. And then he begins to get into them. He says, now is the time to get rid of anger, enrage, malicious behavior, slander, dirty language. Don't lie to each other, for you have stripped off your old sinful nature and all its wicked deeds. And he's referring to these types of dispositions, these postures, these emotions that end up leaking into our behaviors. And he's saying, you're wearing these things like they're garments. Like all these things, it's like they're your clothing. You just took a shower, you're nice and clean, you're nice and fresh, and then you've got those gross things on you. And he says it's time to take those off and get redressed. And he has this great line in verse 10 I love. He says, so put on your new nature and be renewed as you learn to know your Creator and become like him. I love that. Like that's the point. It's to grow in your understanding of who God is, to let that influence your life, and to mirror your Heavenly Father in every way that you possibly can. And then he follows it up with another really powerful line. He says, in this new life, it doesn't matter if you were a Jew or a Gentile, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbaric, uncivilized, slave or free. Christ is all that matters, and he lives in all of us. I love the beauty of that this new life is one that all are invited into. It's one with no barriers or exclusion, but maybe even more importantly, it's a life where there are no other aspects that supersede or take precedence over this new identity we have as followers of Jesus, as children of God. And so he says, since God chose you to be the holy people he loves, you must clothe yourselves. So since God has invited you to this relationship where you get to be his holy people, and that's a word or a phrase that sometimes we go, I don't really like the way that sounds. He's saying, no, you're his representatives who are not condescending or holier than thou, or you look down on other people, but his people who are markedly different, who are so uncommon, who are so set apart, in every single way because of who they follow and who they're becoming. And he says, because of that, like, dress for the part, dress like it. You must clothe yourselves with tender-hearted mercy, with kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Like, these are the things that we are to put on. These are the postures to live out. These are the things that we go, I want to work tirelessly to build these types of things in my character so they flow out of the life that I live. In verse 13, he says, make allowance for each other's faults and forgive anyone who offends you. Be the type of people who do not demand or expect that everyone around you behave the way you like all the time. It's not going to make you happy. And also, in fact, he says, I want you to be prepared. Like, have this extra allowance, this savings account of grace and patience. Be the type of people who don't write others off. Be the type of people who don't avoid resolution. Be the type of people who go, you know what? Something disappointing happened, something offensive happened, but instead I'm going to pursue reconciliation. I'm going to offer forgiveness. And the question then becomes, why would I do anything like that? Like, that doesn't sound very fun. And he goes, oh yeah, well, remember, the Lord forgave you, so you forgive others. Like, because this is how your relationship with your Heavenly Father began, well, this is something that you end up living out as well. This new life you have is founded on that forgiveness and grace and mercy that was shown to you. And so he says, so we just mirror that. We say, I'm not going to let it stop with me, but I'm going to let it flow and extend to those around me. Verse 14, above all, clothe yourselves with love, which binds us all together in perfect harmony. Like, when you live like this type of life, it's going to be better for us. We're going to be healthier emotionally. Our relationships will be better off. We'll have a greater sense of peace and contentment. But maybe more importantly than all that, Paul is saying, when you live like this, you live like the new creations that you actually are. And then he says something amazing in verse 15. He says, let the peace that comes from Christ, let it rule or reign in your hearts. For as members of one body, you are called to live in peace and always be thankful. And what a beautiful exclamation point that is on it all. Let the peace of Christ, let that rule in your hearts. And he's not saying, you know what you should do? You should be willfully blind or naive about life. He's not saying, pretend everything is always the way that you want it. Like, turn that frown upside down, buddy. He's not saying that at all. He's saying there are things that you have through Christ. There's a sense of hope when everything else feels hopeless. And you have this absolute freedom. There's no condemnation that you have, but utter acceptance. You have joy, and you have a sense of worth that cannot be changed. And there is this irrevocable love that God constantly offers you. He says, those things that are yours and that will always be yours, let those things produce a peace in you that fills and flows through every part of you. Let that shape your beliefs and your emotions and your behaviors. And oh, by the way, yeah, always be thankful too, because we know that gratitude and peace are intimately linked. And for so many people, as we think back of that giant dartboard, and right there at that bullseye is this emotional health. I want this emotional wellness. It's what we want. It's what we experience when we have a true sense of peace and contentment in our lives, a real foundation that is steady and not sturdy, and is sturdy. It's the thing that we experience when we're no longer on this like constant up and down roller coaster where we are at the mercy of our mood or our circumstances. But to be honest about this, there's really no quick fix or this really simple recipe of like, hey, if you do these 3 things tonight, tomorrow you're going to have all of those things. And yet what Paul unpacks is the life that followers of Jesus are not only called to walk in, but it's something that everyone's invited to. And as he rolls that out, there's process that we can actually begin that will lead us down the path that we want to walk. And so again, for those of us who say, you know what, I want to follow Jesus with my whole life, with my heart, soul, mind, and strength. I don't want to hold anything back. This is kind of like part of the expectation is that we begin to do these things. And yet, as he lays this out, this is something that if you're not a follower of Jesus, you might go, you know what, I actually want to do that as well because it's going to lead me to a better spot with my emotional health. And the process can begin when we choose to first release or to take off what's harming us. We start by releasing or taking off what's harming us. We remember those words where Paul says, okay, hey, now is the time to get rid of. In other words, he's saying there are these emotions, desires, appetites that are harming us. We may think these things are fine, these things are good. We might tell ourselves that feeding those appetites are going to make us happy, but we probably know better. We know that instead they end up mastering us, or maybe at least holding us back from the people that we want to be, holds us back in our relationships, in our inner lives, in our own personal maturity. And so we begin to identify what those things might be. And maybe they're things like fear or anger, defensiveness, shame. Maybe it's those things. Maybe it's something different. Maybe it's resentment or bitterness. It's a sense of self-centeredness. And likely, what I've noticed about myself is I'm only able to see a small fraction of those things myself, and then it takes the help of others who I'm willing to trust and allow to let in and speak truth to me. And what I personally believe is that as we ask God for his help in identifying and letting go of the things that have harmed us, that he actually gives us his spirit, his personal presence to help us replace or to put on our new nature, to replace the emotions and postures that are harming us with the things that will lead us towards wholeness. So for example, as we threw up those emotions before, as we release fear and anger and defensiveness and shame, what we do is we seek to replace those with fear with trust, and anger with love, and defensiveness with vulnerability, and shame with a sense of worthiness. And this is something it's interesting. If you've ever learned from people who study habit formation, they'll share that when you're wanting to let go of something that's been like a negative aspect of who you are, one of the most helpful things is to actually replace it with a healthier alternative for you. But again, hear me out. This process is much, much longer and much, much more difficult than I wish it were. It's a process where one of the wisest things we can do is to lean on the help of others, especially those who are professionally trained and able to help us here. And let me mention something, is that telling someone to say, hey, you need to release these negative things, just kind of let go of them, let go of the pain that has shaped your life. It can sound really calloused. It can sound really insensitive. It can sound really out of touch. And so I just want to be clear in what I'm not saying. Releasing the emotions that have harmed us is not saying, okay, we need to cover up or we need to live in denial. It's not excusing or ignoring the bad things, the wrong things, the evil things that were done around us or to us. It's simply acknowledging that those feelings are there, and I will recognize that they've shaped my life. And I've decided that because I will not be defined by those things, I'm going to do the difficult work of addressing them and replacing them. There's a great quote from psychologist Henry Cloud, and he says, well, bad things happen to good people, and those bad events affect them. That's not their fault. God is always on the side of the oppressed. But even when we experience life circumstances that were not our fault, we have to work on overcoming those injuries and developing our insides. Like we know, we can't control everything that happens in our lives. In fact, there's so much that's out of our control, but we can decide what we're going to do with it. And the Apostle Paul says, you're going to see some things in your life, the emotions, appetites, postures, things that are hurting you, things that are keeping you back from living the life that God has called you to. And so as you identify them, you release them. And then with the help of God's Spirit, we replace them. We put on the responses and the emotions that will lead to a life of wholeness. And finally, we embrace. We embrace the life that actually will make us happy. And you remember earlier, I said something, a few of you raised your eyebrows. A couple other people were like, I told you that guy wouldn't be trustworthy. I said that in order for us to be happy, we need to do what makes us happy. You're like, that just doesn't sound like that should be something that you say. Well, that right there is pretty counterintuitive, because I think we often think that if I build my life in such a way where I give myself what I want, where I get what I want, where I say yes to my desires and my appetites, and I focus on getting and getting and getting, well, then I will be set. Like that will be it for me. But we know from our own experiences, and we've heard study after study that tells us it doesn't actually work that way. Sociologists point to things we've talked about time and time again around here, like things like the hedonic treadmill. This tells us that after every high we experience, whether it's an achievement or a new relationship or a new purchase, our brains, like nothing else controls, our brains have a way of resetting a baseline level of happiness. And so despite the belief of like, oh, if I get this one thing, it's going to make it better for me, and then I'll always be happy. Well, despite that belief, our brains continually add new levels of expectation that actually make that harder and harder to reach. But then on the other hand, you see countless case studies that will convey something, and that it's always the people who structure their lives not around themselves, but around others. Those are the people who report higher levels of contentment, of joy, of emotional health, of general happiness. These people are happy because they are scientifically doing what leads to lasting happiness. They are doing things like utilizing their talents to serve others, and that makes you happy, scientifically. They're practicing generosity and benevolence. They're incorporating gratitude into their daily routines. They're practicing faith beliefs in an authentic manner. They're committed to living lives of humility, and that's what makes you happy. But more than this, that's what embracing the way of Jesus actually looks like. It is always, always, always a life where we're looking to the people in front of us and saying, not about me, how about you? How can I help? How can I serve? What can I do to make life better for those in front of me? How can I bring more health and wholeness to my relationship with you? And in the process of doing these things, we become more and more like Jesus as we learn, I love that line, to know our Creator and become like Him. And we find greater emotional health and wholeness in ourselves. And so as I mentioned earlier, every week as we talk through these big ideas, we're just saying, okay, hey, what are some of the really practical next steps that we can take away? And as we said, the last thing we want to do is to go, hey, here's another list of to-do stuff. Like, probably not busy in this season, right? So like, here's just some more stuff to figure out. It's not that at all. It's just to go, hey, here's some tools that I need, and maybe these are helpful for us to set us up on that right trajectory. And so as we end, I want to toss out 3 ideas. There's 3 things you could try or not, or maybe there's 3 options you go, hey, one of those I'm going to lock into, and I'm going to do this week. But again, a simple recognition that my heart and your heart, they did not arrive at their present condition overnight. And so none of these things are going to lead us to becoming completely healthy and whole with our emotional selves overnight as well. And so I'm not suggesting that doing one or all of these things will reverse the damage or cause us to thrive immediately. But if we do want to move in that direction, we've got to start somewhere. And so here are some starting points. The first idea is this week, identify and explore. Identify and explore. Last week, I know we mentioned that every day when it comes to our mental health, there's this constant flow of thoughts that are running through our stream of consciousness constantly. And at the same time, you probably recognize that throughout the day, we've got a constant flow of emotions we're experiencing. Some of them are fleeting and they're kind of dull. It's like, no big deal. And others are stronger and maybe last for a while. But I would encourage you this week, as your day is going on, and maybe you do this to start your day, or midway through your day, or at the end, or all 3. But maybe this week, what you might do is do this a few times where during your day, you take a moment to pause and you ask yourself, okay, hey, right now, what emotions am I feeling most strongly right now? Or like, I'm just going to start there. What are these strong emotions that I'm feeling right now? And as you do, you might need to borrow the chart from my 2nd grade classroom, or how are you feeling today? And then it has all these faces, and it was really helpful for 8-year-old me, or maybe an updated version of that kind of helps you put some language to what you're feeling. But once you identify those emotions, you could stop there, or if you want to go a little bit further, a suggestion that I have is to explore some related questions. And so here's a question. Why might that be? So what am I feeling most strongly, and why might that be? What might be the case? What are these emotions telling me? What are they telling me about my hopes or my expectations or my desires? What might be contributing to them? The past experiences, other people? Is it something else? Again, there is so much more we can do in this area. And so I'll say it again, not an end point, it's a starting point. And inviting other trusted voices into the process is key. A second idea to try is to exercise gratitude. To be honest, there are times where people tell me to be more grateful or do things like this, and I think, man, that comes off so naive or maybe even insensitive. Because when you think back on that chart that was my second grade classroom walls and all the different emotions, it isn't just happy or fine. There's a lot of other things that we're feeling, right? And a lot of times the things that we're feeling aren't necessarily those warm and fuzzy emotions. And so isn't it a bit like inauthentic or even unhealthy to pretend that I'm actually grateful when I'm not really in that place? Like if you're thinking that, I get it. I'm the one who said it out loud. But once more, psychologists are identifying some really counterintuitive realities. For instance, even when different people experience adversity or loss or tragedy, the story that they tell themselves about what has happened and how they'll choose to respond, it goes a long way towards shaping their emotional health. Dr. Martin Seligman, he writes on this in his book, love this title, Flourish, A Visionary New Understanding of Happiness and Well-Being. And he says, people tend to spend more time thinking about what is bad in life than is actually helpful. Worse, this focus on negative events sets us up for anxiety and depression. One way to keep this from happening is to get better at thinking about savoring what went well. To overcome our brain's, and this is perfect, natural catastrophic bent, I go there too, we need to work on and practice this skill of thinking about what went well. And so Seligman, he suggests practicing what he calls the what went well exercise. It's very simple. This week, maybe grab a notepad or something that you can use to journal, and at the end of each day, identify 3 positive elements. 3 things that went well. It might be easy, it might be hard. There might be times where like, okay, here's number 1, number 2, and number 3 felt like a stretch, but you do it anyway. They could be large, they can be small. Because when we decide that we will not only be honest with the negative emotions or the difficult circumstances that we face, but in spite of them, or even because of them, we will regularly be on the lookout for the good that we can celebrate. Practicing gratitude is going to lead us to greater emotional stability and a deeper sense of peace. And then one final thing I'm going to toss out that you can try this week, it is to serve in secret. Serve in secret. We've talked about the way of Jesus and how it is always being others-focused and outward directed. And there are countless studies on how lives built around service, generosity, humility, those lead to greater levels of joy, contentment, and fulfillment. And so this week, tap into that cheat code, right? Make it a point to do something for someone else. Something you didn't have to do. It wasn't like, yeah, that was kind of my responsibility. It was nice, but I had to do it. Something where you go, I'm going to decide to go out of my way and do something that is serving a person. Something that you don't do so that they have to do something back for you, right? You put that up on the scoreboard, which sometimes is hard for me. And so to make it more fun, as you serve, as you practice the way of Jesus, maybe do this. Do it without them knowing that you did it. Maybe it's something that you do for somebody that you live with or work with, or something you do for a neighbor or somebody that you just happen to run into at the store. It could be something you do once. It could be something you do daily. You can decide what of these things you're going to do or not going to do. But when we live out the way of Jesus and when we look to make things better for those in front of us, we end up actually doing what makes us happy in the process. And our emotional wellness is so crucial. And just like every other area of our lives, it is interconnected and interrelated with the rest of us, including our spiritual health. And for many people, that topic of their spiritual lives, it can feel a bit like daunting, sometimes discouraging, sometimes like it's a never-ending uphill climb where I'm trying to do less of the things that God doesn't want me to do and more of the things that will make him happy with me. But maybe that's not actually the point. And maybe that's not even a sign of a spiritually healthy person. And so next week, we're going to wrap up our series by talking about what it looks like to pursue spiritual health and wholeness. But before we wind down right now, I got one last thought. And you remember a story from a couple weeks ago where I just nailed it as a dad and I made my kids get up early and garden together, right? Okay, so we were doing that. And before their extended bathroom break, I told you, we're spreading some mulch, and there's a ton of spider webs, and so we had to knock all those down, or at least my kids had to knock all those down. And then we're pulling weeds. And you've seen there's just a ton of rain this winter and this spring, and I didn't keep up with the weeds. And so we had a lot of work to do. So I told the kids like, hey, let's all these weeds that are coming up through the cracks, I need you guys to get rid of them. And so I see my son, and he goes out, and just there on the top, he just like pulls a leaf off the weed. And it's like, okay, hey, buddy, let me show you what you want to do. When you pull the weed, you actually want to get the root. You want to pull it up. And I think he understood, but he was like, but it already looks better than it did. And it's like, that you're right, but here's the thing. When you do that, it looks good for a little bit, but the root actually gets bigger and gets stronger and gets harder to deal with in the end. And when it comes to our emotions, we can treat them on the surface level. I can choose to ignore what my emotions are telling me. I can medicate them. We can do things to take the edge off. We can hide them from people so they don't see what's underneath, but that only masks it for a little bit. And eventually, our emotions spill out to the people who are closest to us, whether we want them to or not. And so I say this as a reminder to all of us and to people who have an influential role in the life of a person, whether you're a teacher or a coach or a mentor or anything else. But I want to say this especially to dads this weekend, that what is in our hearts, it shapes us, but it does not remain with us because it overflows into the lives of those who are closest to us. Which means that if I don't do the work of releasing the destructive emotions that are within me, there's a chance I might end up hurting and harming the ones that I love the most. But however, the inverse is true, that when we choose to be wise and brave and vulnerable, and we choose to work to replace those destructive responses with healthy and life-giving postures, we show those around us what it actually looks like to be emotionally healthy and increase the likelihood that they will experience emotional wholeness themselves. And that's the type of life we want for ourselves and we want for others. Let's pray together. Lord, I know that just talking about a topic like this, it hits everybody in a different spot, and some of us feel drawn in and just excited to hear and to process through this, and others feel maybe even called out. It's just uncomfortable. Some of us grew up in settings where emotional health was the furthest thing from reality, and others had that modeled for us really faithfully. And so whatever the case, I just want to humbly ask for your help to release any feelings of guilt or shame that we might be processing through, and to start to do the work of releasing the things that are destructive, replacing them with postures that bring health, and embracing the way of Jesus. And I pray that as we do, our ever-increasing emotional health would pour out into the lives of those around us. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you, Scott. Man, so good, so good. I am excited to do the What Went Well exercise this week, and then just the challenge as a dad to make sure that what's spilling out of us is healthy and whole for the people who live with us. And so that's really good stuff. Hey, thank you again so much for being here. Part of a Father's Day weekend, and it's just been great to have you. Before you take off, just want to remind you about that Connect card I was telling you about earlier. And you can write set up or show up or clean up somewhere on that card. Make sure you throw that in the offering basket on your way out. In fact, you can throw anything that you're not keeping or taking with you in that offering basket. You might want to pull your message notes out and keep those with you. And of course, you can place, you might want to grab this and take that along with you as well. Maybe think of somebody you can invite back in a couple of weeks as we're starting our new series, The Reality of Life. And you can also drop this offering envelope in the basket on the way out too. And the study after study has shown that there's a certain kind of person who's happier than other kinds of people. People who exercise gratitude, that's huge. People who serve. And it's not just serving one time that gives you this killer buzz. It's this active lifestyle of serving and generosity. It really is true that people who are more generous, even if they don't have much, typically have a much higher level of happiness. That serving and generosity and being others-oriented just makes us happier, healthier, whole human beings. And so that's the kind of community we want to be. We think generosity changes the world, but we also think generosity changes us. And it really, really does. So thank you so much for your generosity this weekend. And of course, as we always say, you can give online and on the app. And then next weekend, we're saying this, Scott said we've got this spiritual wholeness topic that we're going to talk about. But also, I just want to let you know, next Sunday night, at 5 p.m., we're going to have another night of worship and prayer. I think it'll go just hand in hand with what we're talking about tomorrow, next weekend in the series. But we also have this desire to as often as we can, to be placing ourselves individually and collectively in this spot where we can just connect with God's Spirit and maybe linger a little bit, take a little bit more time to worship, to pray, to reflect, to sing, to practice communion or the Lord's Supper, and just take these kinds of things inside of us, because we think those things just make us healthier and whole and shape our hearts and our character. So that's coming up next Sunday night, and I hope you'll join us for that. It's going to be really special. So that's next weekend. We're in part 4 of the series. It's the series finale, Healthy and Whole. And why don't you grab a invite card that you've got? Think of somebody you can invite back next week with you as our series winds down. Now, what's going to happen next? If you were thinking you were going to do this, you can hang out. If you weren't thinking you can do this, you can still hang out. Is right next door, in the room next door. We've got a bunch of Buffalo Wild Wings. We've got a nacho bar set up, and we just want to invite everybody next door to hang out for a while, eat some good food, some music's going to be playing, get to know people, and spend some time with us before Father's Day kicks off tomorrow morning. God bless you guys. Thank you so much for being here. Have a fantastic Father's Day weekend.